Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. Welcome to the third and final day of our conference on institutions and politics in Iran. Over the last 2 days, we've been discussing the nature and evolution of the Iranian political system, its place in the broader context of Iranian history, the nature and evolution of protests, the role and functions of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the varieties and of elections, and in particular, the parliament, the functions of the parliament. And today we're going to turn our attention to elections, foreign policy making, and the judiciary. Joining us in this discussion are four experts on each of these fields. We start today with Professor Abdul Rasul Div Salar, who joins us from Italy. He is a professor at the Catholic University of Milan and also is affiliated with the European University Institute. Dr. Div Salar will discuss the foreign policy establishment in Iran and how Iranian foreign policy is formulated and manifests itself. Then we're joined by Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh and Mahmoud Pargu. Professor Akbarzadeh and Dr. Pargu have co-authored a piece on the nature of elections in Iran. And we will today hear from Shahram Akbarzadeh, and of course, Professor Pargu will join for the Q&A session. They're both at Deakin University in Australia. They're joining us from Australia. Shahram Akbarzadeh is the convener of the Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University, and Dr. Pargu is a research fellow at Deakin University. And then last but by no means least is my own colleague here at the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, Hamideh Dorzadeh, who is a coordinator at the Iranian Studies Unit here, who will be discussing the transition of the Iranian judiciary and the nature and functions of the judiciary. So we're in for a huge treat with these presentations, and without further delay, we'll go to Abdul Rasul Div Salar, and Abdul Rasul, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mehran. Congratulations for the last 2 days of interesting events, and thank you for having me in this panel. Today I will talk about Iran's foreign policy establishment, which is basically a network of institutions working in different domains of foreign policy or influencing on that, and is characterized by being complex and opaque in the way that they function. My argument today will frame around three main, questions. I will argue that what were the factors in the last 40 years that contributed in the evolution of the Islamic Republic foreign policy establishment. Then I will switch to the fact that what might be a better view or a standpoint to study and look at these diverse foreign policy establishment. And then at the end, I will touch some points on how these establishment make decisions. On my first point, I should say that I think two factors have been quite critical in the way that this establishment has evolved in the last 4 decades. The first is the reality that the elites in Islamic Republic, or those loyal elites, or khodiha, as it's called in Farsi, have been in a status of having a privileged access to resources. But these resources includes the legal rights to establish organization and information to decide on foreign policy issues. So many of us may agree that in post 1979 period, after the revolution, the Islamist views were dominated, or at least there has been a serious attempt to dominate the Islamist narrative. But as also many other panelists in this panel today have shown in their previous works, the plurality of identity and power resources has been the feature of the last 40 decades. But the point is that I think the Islamic Republic's approach to deal with these plurality and diversity of its elite had two phases, major phases. Of course, it was partly dealt with the political violence, but on the other side, there has been this attempt to recognize the diversity of elites, those elites who are inside that loyal framework of recognizing the Velayat al-Faqih. So these group of elites have had a constant access, no matter they were reformists or conservatives, but they had the privileged access to resources. And that is the key dimension of how different institutions evolved in the different directions throughout presidencies and after presidencies. I will give some example to elaborate this case. For example, when we see the Hashemi Rafsanjani's post-presidency period, there are critical moments in which he impacts foreign policy decisions in a position outside the presidency, in a position which is Expediency Council and normally is not part of the foreign policy establishment. But his movement from the office of president to the other positions also moved his views and narratives and did not lead to the let's say, eradication of his foreign policy views and objectives. The same pattern, I mean, also Rafsanjani, the critical point of his foreign policy decision that later led to the Rouhani government was the Center for Strategic Studies that led a huge contribution to the remaining of these views. But also the same pattern we can see in Khatami period, that after his presidency, the tenure of being a president, he started the Baran Foundation. His foreign minister moved into the office of leader and started the Council on Foreign Relations. And in this way, the argument is that the movement of elites and the possibility among these elites in order to modify institutions, in order to create new institutions, and in order to shape the institutions based on their views of fractional politics was one of the key domains of forming Iran foreign policy establishment. The second factor, which I think was equally important, is the reality that the Islamic Republic has survived in a period of crisis and perpetual situation of urgencies. So the system, in fact, has created a kind of political rationality or problem-solving logic that is circular or that is framed around security matters. So Islamic Republic is a creature. Its foreign policy is a product of its reactions to its security environment and its threat-centric reactions. That has been a critical factor in forming foreign policy institutions. It created these situational attempts to adjust with threat and its security environment, has created critical junctures in formation of institutions in foreign policy that has had impacts beyond those moments. I think the most important case in this matter is the IRGC Quds forces. So Quds forces, Quds forces as a foreign policy power or as a foreign policy actor in a way that we know it today is a product of the 2001-2003 moments or critical junctures, I call it, when the threat level on Iran was high and its assets, its networks, and its security value for Iranian leadership become evident. So it gradually gave rise to the emergence of Quds Force as a part of Iran's foreign policy institution. So based on these two factors, I mean, the privileged access to the resources and the situational reactions to the threat dynamics, I think the evolution of Iran foreign policy was not basically based on the source of its constitution. So the constitution is playing a limited role, or at least a very broad framing perspective informing the establishment. However, other factors outside the constitution are playing a bigger role in formation of the ultimate form of foreign policy. So the end of this part, I will switch to the second point, that in this, let's say, dynamic institution making or building process, how might be a better way to map these different institutions? I think one of the good ways could be to trace different institutions' roles and the change and the dynamic of different roles that institutions find during the time. In my work, which I try to show at least 5 different roles that have been created in Iran's foreign policy establishment throughout the last 4 decades. And I think we can group the different actors which are present right now in Iran foreign policy establishment under each of these 5 different roles that they are playing. The first role is what I call institutions of agenda setting. So there are a number of important institutions and rising one, including from think tanks, the growing number of think tanks in Tehran, to also some more formal structures like, for example, Secretariat of the Expediency Council or Center for Strategic Studies, which are official let's say, institutions, that they're working as agenda setters. That means there are platforms of debate, there are platforms that different actors attempt to push their views of foreign policy and shape the both public and elite debates on foreign policy issues. These institutions are not necessarily part of the decision taking process, or are not necessarily part of the even decision, we may call them involving decision making process, but they're not necessarily part of that decision taking process. Even supreme leaders, representatives in provinces somehow work in this role. The second role, which I think is equally important, are institutions of propagation, which basically deals with a huge number. This is the most crowded area of Iran foreign policy. Deals with a huge number of organizations, religious and clerical organizations, that are active in pushing the idealistic and that revolutionary narrative of Iran's Islamic Republic. And they're mostly under the Office of Supreme Leader, from Organization of Islamic Culture and Relation to Al-Mustafa University to Ahlul Bayt Assembly and many other institutions. These are institutions that have their own domain of action in order to, in a form of religious diplomacy, and basically are serious actors of foreign policy institutions, but also might involve in case-by-case issues of Iran foreign policy. For example, when we talk about the Iran-Saudi Arabia relations, these institutions are more important in decision-taking process than other institutions. And then the third group, or third role that I may talk about, is the institutions of executive institutions, the institutions that actually execute the decisions that has been made. Now, with this release of the Zarif tape and then the Khamenei's reaction, we may more surely talk about the fact that Ministry of Foreign Affairs is an executive body, though it is taking place in, it is let's say, presence in some foreign policy decision taking, but it's more executive body. But also I see Quds Force as a kind of executive body, while it is again taking part of decision taking process, but it is more a medium level organization that is participating in execution of the decision that have been already taken. And also the parliament, I view that these three are the most important executive bodies of Iran foreign policy establishment. And then the fourth and the most important group of institutions are those who are actually coordinating and make arbitrations, institutions of coordination arbitration. The leader himself, his office, the president and his office, and the Supreme National Security Council are the four bodies that are acting as coordination and arbitration bodies. The final decisions in Islamic Republic are taking place in a process of debate among these four, let's say, institutions. But in more or less, these are in different ways. Even, for example, Security Council or the Supreme National Security Council are the platforms that high-level coordinations are taking place, but not necessarily a kind of direct decision are taking place in for example, SNN's Supreme National Security Council. So and finally, the fifth group, or the fifth role that I think is quite active and critical in current format of Iran's foreign policy institution, are the institutions of guardianships. Well, we know Council of Guardians very well, but there are other number of institutions active in this role. That basically means a role which is dealing about protecting the revolution from infiltration and protecting the revolution from the transformation of its values and its core concepts. These includes a combination of security and legislative bodies, like the Guardian Council, like the Ministry of Intelligence, the intelligence body of the IRGC, even Supreme Leader representatives, again, will come here and play a role in limiting and framing and forming the decision making. So these groups are basically, again, crowded in a number of actors and influential because they can define the boundaries and set the boundaries of decision and work hard to guarantee the faithful implementation of the leader's perspective of foreign policy. So in this way, I think by analyzing the movement of the roles, as I said, we can see that different institutions, according to the situation, can have different roles and can play in different patterns, in different moods, depending on the situation. And then my last part, I think I'm going to run out of the time, is the fact that how decisions in this complex process are taking place. Well, I think decision making in Iran foreign policy is very much subject centric. Depending on the priority of the subject and depending on the importance of the subject, the actors, the roles, and institutions involved in decision-making process change. So, for example, there are areas of foreign policy, which I call them abandoned area of foreign policy, in Farsi, Manateq o Firaq. There are areas of foreign policy in Iran that basically they don't have any owner, and executive bodies have a more let's say, freedom of action and autonomy to decide and act what they think. For example, many of Iran's decisions in Africa were out of a big strategic plan, or the Supreme Leader or the National Security Council were not directly involved. The Ahmadinejad's approach toward Africa is one of those areas that is telling us how this Manateq o Firaq or abandoned area works. But there is another group of subjects which are preserved area of foreign policy, which I call. And these are areas that are dominated by the Supreme Leader and the military security complexes. For example, when we talk about Iran-Russia relationship or Iran-Israel relationship, these are highly securitized and involved with high level of identity politics that are basically the red lines and are impossible in order to have a major impact. For example, the Iran-Russia relation, despite the very dynamic debate inside the system, the final decision-taking process is happening in the office of the leader and by Khamenei and by his military security team rather than debates. And finally, the largest group of subjects and the most important maybe are among the group of topics that are basically Iran's crisis of foreign policy. These includes a large number of issues from nuclear issue to Iran's relation with its neighbors, to US-Iran relation, which the particularity of the subjects prevents Supreme Leader and other actors to limit and decide in closed circles. So there is a process of a debate, national level debate, that here becomes the importance of those agenda setting actors that are platform of debates. And then these debates are filtered in the National Security Council to create the first boundaries of decision, and then the final decision is taking place in a consensus limited consensus, which I argue, between the leader, the president, the National Security Council, and the office of the Supreme Leader. And my last point is that it's true that many times it's important to arrive to a consensus in these last group of decisions. But Iran's foreign policy decision-making are full of moments of fragile decisions and even indecisions because of the lack of consensus. For example, FATF is a recent example that shows how arriving to a consensus sometimes become impossible, or the nuclear case is a good case to study to see how the consensus can become fragile and not sustainable in long term. So I will stop here, Mehran, and deal with more detailed, particularly the last part of decision-making process in Q&A session. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much. This was by far one of the most thorough and comprehensive and at the same time concise analyses of the foreign policy establishment in Iran that I have heard. So thank you so very much, Abdul Rasul. Really appreciate it. And now we turn to the role of elections and how elections in Iran can have either rewards or risks or both by Shahram Akbarzadeh. Shahram, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamrava. I'm going to share my PowerPoint, if you don't mind. So thanks for the opportunity. This is a paper that I have prepared with my colleague, Dr. Mahmoud Pagu at Deakin University. We're looking at elections. Primarily, we have an interest in presidential elections, but the rationale is the same. Elections are seen as an exercise in raising legitimacy, but also they present challenges for the regime. So we want to have a look at how that dynamic is played out in the context of Iran. So I'll start by saying a few words about the makeup of the Iranian model of government, which is probably, I think all participants here would have a fair idea of how the system is run, but it's good to review it because it's quite revealing. Then have a look at some of the elections in the past, the patterns that have emerged in past elections, and then look at some of the risks and rewards that the regime expects to get out of elections. So here is the system of government. We have heard of the supreme leader. We have heard of president and the parliament. Let's look at the relationship between them. I think this is quite revealing. You have a number of elected bodies, president, parliament, council of experts, and city councils. But then we also have unelected bodies. The supreme leader at the top is, while nominally elected, is effectively an appointed position. Who sits at the very top as the head of state. The supreme leader appoints the head of the armed forces, the judiciary, broadcasting, the state broadcasting agency, and many other agencies. So the supreme leader, as an unelected person, has effectively total control over key state bodies in Iran. The supreme leader appoints the 6 members of the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council is positioned at the center of this diagram because the Guardian Council effectively makes sure that the system runs. The Guardian Council has authority to vet candidates for the parliament. The Guardian Council has authority to vet candidates for the presidency. And there have been cases where sitting members of the parliament were vetted out and not allowed to run for at the next election. So the Guardian Council is a very critical player in maintaining stability of the system as a whole. I'm going to move on to the next. So here's just a quick overview of how elections have shaped up in Iran. We have the presidential and parliamentary elections, and you will see ebbs and flows. And interestingly, traditionally, when we have had high participation rate in elections, the reformist camp has been the winner. And this is very true in the presidential election of 1997, when Khatami came to office. 79% participation rate, which is quite impressive. Khatami managed to get 66% of the participation of the, bringing people to the ballot boxes next time he stood for elections. And that was because there was a certain degree of disillusionment and I guess lack of confidence in how he had performed. And you might say that what happened in 2001 and the war in Afghanistan, with President George W. Bush talking about Iran being an axis of evil, all of that really helped the conservative camp to marginalize reformists who've been talking about opening up to the West, or Khatami's famous dialogue of civilization, and opened the way to the conservative takeover in 2005 and again 2009. 2009 is an anomaly. 84% participation rate, and you would expect that the reformists would win the election. Ahmadinejad won the election, and it does stand as an exception to the rule, where participation rate was very high, but a conservative, even a hardliner, managed to win the elections. I don't subscribe to the idea that the election was stolen. I think despite the fact that there were large-scale irregularities and fraud in that poll, they wouldn't have changed the result fundamentally. And then we come to, we have Rouhani, but then we have come to Raisi's election victory only recently in June this year, with 48% participation rate, which is quite low by all measures. The first time ever that a presidential election has fallen below 50%. The Supreme Leader was very concerned about this. Many observers in Iran were very concerned about this because election participation rate has been seen widely as a vote of confidence in the regime as a whole. Supreme Leader came out, invited everyone to participate. He said, doesn't matter if you disagree with me, you still need to participate. So given that background and given the significance that the regime places on elections, this is quite a damning verdict on regime's popularity or lack of. Just a quick snapshot of women participation, women shares in the parliament, which has not exceeded 6%. It did go up to 5.9 in 2016, but it has not really gone even beyond that. So it's quite disappointing to see the share of women. Another revealing graph is the share of clerics in the parliament, which has been dropping significantly, dropped from 55 to 6, and now only recently in the last election it went up to 31%. So it's quite revealing that the parliament in Iran was in many ways moving away from the clerical message, from having a clerical representation, which appears to have galvanized the clerical class to really make a comeback. Now, risks and rewards. That's how elections are defined in Iran. The very first thing that we need to be very cognizant of is that elections provide legitimacy. The system in Iran, as I mentioned, you have a number of elected bodies and unelected bodies. And it goes to the very heart of the Iranian regime as being a hybrid. On the one hand, Iranian regime rests on divine legitimacy. It's Islamic. Therefore, the regime doesn't need to have popular mandates to be legitimate. On the other hand, it's a republic. And the republic obviously requires the popular mandate. So this tension has been managed within the regime. This tension is present in the constitution. This tension is present in the institutions of the state. And this tension has been managed by having elections that are carefully curated, carefully orchestrated and managed. Popular legitimacy is an important aspect that the Iranian regime cannot forego. It cannot drop elections altogether. It also gives Iran a certain level of legitimacy internationally in its international dealings. And it does help Iran project an image of bringing something new to the Muslim world so that Iran can be Islamic, but also a model of democracy for the rest of the Muslim world. That message was very successful in the very first decade or decades of the Islamic Republic. It has lost a lot of currency now, given the sectarian tensions in the region and how the Arab world predominantly has lost confidence in Iran as a model of Islamic Republic and the view that Iran is really a sectarian power. So that the value, the PR value of Islamic Republic in the region has really lost its credibility. Nonetheless, maintaining elections, running elections is still serves Iran's international image. Elections also serve as a very useful tool of relieving tensions as a safety valve. A lot of the anger, angst, disappointment against government policies can be expressed through electoral campaigns. It can manifest in opposition, registered opposition, accepted opposition, and it can be played out openly, which does provide a certain level of, as an early warning system, but also giving the sense that the regime is able to adopt some of those concerns and adapt and change. So providing possibilities for change. And the idea that the regime can change, it's not just that the regime will change, that's one thing, but the idea that it propagates among the population, among the electorate, that by going to the ballot boxes, you can enforce change. It gives confidence to the regime. And of course, the last factor is preventing radicalization. It's clear that if the disenfranchised population in Iran can find a way of articulating its grievances, articulating its concerns through the ballot box, through the election process, then it does take away some of the need to go to extreme and be radicalized. So that's why it's important to have elections. Now, these are not risk-free exercises. Every time there's an election, there is a risk that things can get out of hand. And that's a wild card factor. There is always a risk that there would be an election surprise, that people's loyalties would be questioned. Also, I think more fundamentally, the first point on discursive risk. By continuing to hold elections on a regular basis at various levels, at the city level, at parliament level, for a president, there is the value and principle that is promoted, reinforced, and repeated, that people's votes matter, that people's sovereignty matter, and that people can change the direction of the regime, and that can lead to a lot of questioning. That can lead to questioning, why do we need to have a supreme leader to have the final say and act as the head of state when we're electing our president? Why do we need to have a guardian council to vet out our elected members of parliament? So these discursive questions can really come up and challenge the whole rationale of the Islamic regime. So the regime, again, is trying to manage those risks in order to benefit from the rewards of elections by trying to minimize surprise outcomes. Disqualifying questionable candidates, for example, is a very common tactic that is used, and the Guardian Council does it very effectively. I can't remember the number of candidates who put their name up for the last presidential election. I think in the vicinity of 600. It was really trickled down to a really small number, handful. So disqualification is a very widely used method to manage risk. Press freedom, obviously, is used to manage risk and ensure that the messages that are being broadcast in social media and also in official media does not undermine the official message of the state. Limiting the authority of elected office is another area. As I mentioned, the president is not the head of state, supreme leader is. In fact, the president, and I want to go back to that graph because it's quite revealing. The president has to go through approval of the Guardian Council to stand for election. But the Guardian Council itself is appointed by the judiciary, 6 members of the judiciary, and another 6 members of the parliament. Now, who was the head of judiciary at the last presidential election? Mr. Raisi. So Mr. Raisi appointed 6 judges to the Guardian Council who decided whether or not he could stand for presidential election. It becomes a very closed loop. And Raisi did not even resign as head of judiciary at the time when the Guardian Council was going through the vetting process. It does make a mockery of elections, forget about free and fair, any elections or any standard really. And the last item of risk mitigation by the regime is really using PR technology, smart technology to manipulate what is being said on social media and what could be said on social media. My colleague, Dr. Pargu, has done a lot of work in that space, so I'm keen to hear some of the questions you might have and for Dr. Pargu to respond to those. So in conclusion, I think we can see, especially in the last election, that the regime's tolerance of dissent and its appetite for taking risk has really fallen dramatically. The way that the Guardian Council has vetted out potential dissidents, vetted out reformists, vetted out anyone who had any chance or any inkling of presenting a challenge to the supreme leader and his vision. And that has really been demonstrated in the approved candidates for the Guardian Council, and has really undermined the overall excitement and willingness of the population to take part in the elections. And by definition, it has undermined the regime's political legitimacy as a whole. So I'm going to stop share now, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you so very much, Shahram. That was excellent. And we know that hybrid regimes or authoritarian regimes that sponsor elections, as you mentioned, face a number of risks and also some opportunities. And we're looking forward to carrying the discussion on that topic further with you and Dr. Pargu in the Q&A session. So now we turn to the role of the judiciary and the transitions that it has experienced since its inception with my colleague Hamida Dorzadeh. Hamida, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Dr. Kamrava, and I'm very pleased to be part of this conference among very distinguished Iran scholars. So I think, first of all, I guess we have to be clear that the idea of judiciary as an institution is not something that the Islamic Republic invented, and the judiciary, or what people who participated in the constitutional revolution demanded, House of Justice, was established by Iran's 1906 constitution. And actually, the clergy had a prominent role to play within the judiciary at the time. And the Sharia system had jurisdiction in both personal and civil law. However, the role of the clergy diminished actually during the Reza Shah period and his efforts to modernize the judiciary as an institution. So the establishment of the Islamic Republic marked the revival of the role of the clergy in Iran's judiciary. And actually, following the 1979 revolution, it became one of the important institutions to enforce Khomeini's idea of an Islamic government. While, as I said, Reza Shah's reforms of especially the penal codes reduced the role of the religious courts and the clergy, the post-revolutionary state strengthened their role and provided them with the opportunity to draft laws in accordance with their conceptualization of Sharia. So I argue that since then, the judiciary has been used as a political tool to repress any dissent within the system, and that the judiciary has consistently worked to strengthen the position of the supreme leader instead of safeguarding the rights of the Iranian people. While efforts, of course, have been made by different judiciary heads to respond to some of the public criticisms raised against the judiciary, and these are really well known, for example, corruption, high number of cases, and inadequate performance, many of the reforms actually sought by different judiciary heads, they haven't been implemented, and the institution continues to struggle with corruption and inefficiency. However, I have to say that despite the significance of the judiciary as an institution within Iran's political system, there were a few scholarly works, both in English and Persian, that discuss the judiciary as an institution in depth. So a lot of them, especially within the English literature, they discuss judiciary Islamization as state-building processes. And also within Iran, they focus mainly on how the judiciary is actually an instrument of Sharia. Also, they focus on the structure of the judiciary, which I'll get to in a moment. But up until now, no one has seen the judiciary as strengthening the role of Khamenei. So my point here is that other than the normal function of the judiciary, which includes enforcing Sharia orthodoxy and adjudication, within the Iranian system, the institution of the judiciary actually has an additional function, which is to stifle dissent and also strengthen the position of Khamenei. And to make this point, I'm actually looking at the structure, evolution, and function of the judiciary. And when you look at actually the structure of the Islamic Republic's judiciary, the 1979 Constitution, it established actually a judiciary system based on Sharia law, as I said, because this was part of the Islamization process that was taking place at the time. So it formed a high judicial council to manage the judicial affairs of the country. So I'm not going to go in depth about the different responsibilities it had, but the main ones were setting up organizations in the Ministry of Justice or just administrative obligations like preparing bills and so on. So with the constitutional amendments of 1989, the council was replaced by the position of the head of the judiciary. And since then, the judicial power has become concentrated in a single person. And I have to say that this was part of the state's efforts to centralize the judiciary and also to reduce the potential for disagreements at the highest levels, which was actually the case with the High Council of the Judiciary. So the head of the judiciary, he is appointed by the supreme leader for a period of 5 years. And some of the characteristics in theory are that he needs to be a scholar of jurisprudence, or he needs to be, having some certain knowledge about the judicial matters and so on, which is not quite different than the responsibilities that the High Judicial Council had. So when we look at actually the background of those who served as judiciary heads, we find that all of them have been insider clerics, and sometimes they had no formal judicial experience, as was the case with Larijani. So just to give you an overview of the evolution of judiciary and the institution, and the institution and its changes and transformation under various judiciary heads, and I'm not going to go in depth, but I just want to highlight certain moments and also certain reforms that were sought by the different judiciary heads that were really important, and that actually shaped the makeup of the judiciary until present time. So when the judiciary head position was established, actually Yazdi was the first judiciary head. And in fact, he was an insider cleric as well. And actually Khamenei, in his letter to Yazdi, he emphasized that he expected him, in continuation of his efforts within Iran's justice system, to make the judiciary fully Islamic. So other than actually, and just to show you the extent to which he was an insider, that other than his role in the judicial affairs, he was also a member of the Assembly of Experts and also the Guardian Council. So he then, listening to Khamenei, he continued the Islamization process of the judiciary. And actually following his appointment, the conservative judiciary, he started to arrest journalists and close down many reformist newspapers, and this shows you the extent to which dissent is not tolerated. And also in September 1998, same thing happened when the judiciary actually formed a press court following the passing of a bill by the Majlis that accused different journalists of denouncing the principles of Islam, of threatening national security. So during this time, it was actually during the Khatami's presidency, there were many journalists who were arrested, attacked, murdered, and so on. And the judiciary actually continued to stifle dissent by also shutting down different newspapers, and Salam newspaper was one of them. And this led to many demonstrations by Tehran University students. And a lot of the students were brutally attacked during this time. And when the situation got worse, The judiciary actually, there was 100 policemen who were arrested and tried for their attacks on the students. So the judiciary intervened, and also actually the supreme leader and the Majlis. So the Majlis, they halted the press bill, and also Khamenei replaced Yazdi with another cleric called Shahrudi. But before I get into that, I just have to say that one of the very significant reforms that were implemented by Yazdi in 1994 was actually the elimination of the appeal system. And this is very important because it was meant to actually address the shortage of religious jurists at the time, and also the high number of cases. So basically what this meant was that the new courts were supposed to be run by only one judge, but actually what could guarantee justice was not the procedure, but the characteristics of the judge, for example, his fairness and so on. So the verdict of the judge was actually final, with no appeal process except for severe sentences. So it was actually until Shahrudi's role or tenure that the Majlis passed the law of re-establishing the appeal courts. However, the judiciary continued with shortage of, challenges like shortage of judges, and also the prosecutors' offices were not established in all provinces. And similar to Yazdi's period, there were still, the courts were still in the hand of inexperienced judges. For instance, I think between 2001 and 2004, the judiciary licensed for over 4,000 lawyers who did not take the bar exams for the Bar Association. So basically the reforms that were sought in these two periods were mainly focused on the infrastructural development of the judiciary and addressing the issue of efficiency. But it was not about justice nor about accountability. And the repression of dissent by the judiciary, of course, continued with the tenures of Larijani and Iran's upcoming president, Raisi. And Larijani, in fact, he was appointed by Khamenei in the midst of large-scale crackdowns against protesters and increased violence by the security forces. And he was also, again, another insider. So prior to his appointment, Larijani was a member of the Guardian Council for 8 years. And then he had very close ties with Khamenei, and I think that appears to have compensated for his lack of qualification for the position. So similar to Shahrudi's period, Larijani's tenure was also criticized for increased financial and economic corruption. But despite the allegations, of course, of corruption, he continues to be an insider. And unlike Larijani, Raisi, on the other hand, he had a very long career in the judiciary. But despite his expertise in the Iranian judiciary and his experience with the branch, his appointment was actually problematic because of his involvement in the execution of political prisoners in 1988. But one of the significant things I would say, and I would not credit this to the Raisi tenure, but one of the significant things that he did was he launched a high-profile anti-corruption campaign that was targeting especially former high-ranking officials that were involved in major economic and financial cases. So right after he was appointed, he actually dismissed at least 60 judges in an attempt to cleanse the judiciary from within. And he also attacked Larijani's former deputy, Akbar Tabari. And just to conclude and just make sense of what I said so far, the judiciary actually functions directly under the rule of the Islamic Republic's supreme leader. And the politicization of the judiciary is an attempt to ensure the survival of the system, and actually has led to many human rights abuses and the establishment of unconstitutional institutions like revolutionary courts. So by politicization of the judiciary, what I mean by that is that political considerations and also state interests have guided judicial decisions instead of legal principles. So while some of reforms and changes have been made following the establishment of the judiciary head position, actually they have mainly focused, as I said, on the performance and the efficiency of the judiciary. And they were mainly top-down approach to reform rather than a bottom-up process that would involve the Iranian people. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Hamida. The Iranian judiciary, as with all other institutions, is extremely complex, and you did a brilliant job at examining it for us and breaking it down. There are a number of questions that have come to us through social media. So I ask our participants, our discussants, to please keep your responses brief so that we can get to all of the questions and get through as many of them as possible. We may not be able to get through all of them. So, Abdul Rasul, the first question is directed at you. We often hear that Iran's foreign policy is ideological and supposedly revolutionary. To what extent is Iran's foreign policy guided by identity and ideology versus strategic concerns and considerations?
Thank you, Mehran. That's a very good and difficult question also to answer. I think the approach that I follow, at least, is that I think this synthesis or coexistence of different political elites, in the circle of elites in Iran, has given rise to three main narratives, which I call revolutionary idealists, which are seeing the role of Iran as a kind of spiritual leader of the world. But also there are security-seeking idealists, which are a mixture of idealism and revolutionary goals with the concerns over the security. And the third group of narratives, which are developmentalists, which I see, for example, people close to Rouhani and pragmatists and the narrative that was created in Center for Strategic Research as that type. So the point is that the most influential figure in Iran foreign policy, which is Ayatollah Khamenei, I categorized him as a security-seeking idealist. I think he has important security concerns, and that's why he is always concerned about the issue of survival of the political system. But at the same time, he's following, because of those core group of supporters, serious ideological values. And that mixture is really where the directions of Iran's foreign policies is taking place. As I already mentioned in my analysis, I think the Iran's systemic attempt to live through threats and live through a situation of urgencies is the most important contextual factor informing its foreign policy direction. And this is, I think, very much well seen if we look at the office of the leader, for example, the combination of the advisors that he has, which are from mostly military and security complexes, and the power of these groups, even over the ideologists. So when I was in my research doing some interviews with the people who are actually more involved in those institutions of propagations, a very interesting point that I realized was the fact that most of these people agree the fact that security organizations are, which function as a kind of institutions of guardians, as I earlier said, are systematically monitoring the ideological dimension and framing the ideological dimension of Iran foreign policy. So to sum up my argument, I think that if we see Ayatollah Khomeini and his key figures, key advisors close to him as a mixture of ideologists and security figures, I think the directions of Iran foreign policy is this mixture of political rationality, which is coming from the concerns over security, plus some goals of ideologic nature.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Can I jump in here? I have a follow-up question on that.
Sure. Go ahead.
So, Dr. Deep Salar, I thought, thank you very much for your presentation. It made really good sense of a very complex situation. And the question always does come up, who's in charge? Who's making decisions? But can we just stay on that point a little bit more? Because the image I'm getting from your presentation is that there is a lot of plurality decision-making in negotiation, consensus building in foreign policy making. But you also touched on some areas that are hot topics and are not open for discussion. There are red lines. And Foreign Minister Zarif has already indicated that there are some red lines he cannot cross even before the release of those audio recordings. When he was asked about Iran's policy on Syria, he would say, why are you asking me? I don't make decisions on that. So who's in charge in terms of foreign policy making? Can you reflect on that, please?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Akbarza. That's
sorry, Abdul, before you answer, if I could ask, you could be brief so we can get to the other questions. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe I should say that I think that the final decision is coming up from the balance of coalition of balance of forces inside the political system. I think, for example, if we see how the decisions were made during the last years of Ahmadinejad in the nuclear file and compare it with Rouhani, we have some ideas. This balance of force, I think, has a quite powerful impact on the way that the system assess threats. For example, during the Ahmadinejad period, the nuclear fight and confrontation with the West was not seen as a real threat. And if you, for example, listen to another interview of Ali Akbar Salehi, he was mentioning that Ahmadinejad deliberately postponed negotiation with Americans in Oman for a year. That was coming from the argument that despite the Office of Leaders push toward that direction and an agreement that leader had over this, the president and the whole internal debate over how the level of threat is and what is the level of threat, and the balance of force inside is playing a big role. So what I want to say is that I think the decision, because of the plurality of the system, but also because the problem is that the lack of arriving to consensus, as I mentioned earlier, is taking in a very open forward and backward process between the Supreme National Security Council, the Office of the Leader, the President, and the leader. But the problem is that I don't agree with the idea that the leader himself, in many cases, can enter into the decision and can implement because of the institutional diversity that we see, that he doesn't necessarily control many of the executive bodies, but at the same time, he's bounded by his advisors and the view that the military security complexes have, which may find a kind of a coalition with the president. That was what we see during the Ahmadinejad period, a coalition between a group inside the IRGC, the intelligence organization of IRGC, and Ahmadinejad was leading to that assessment of the threat, which was not necessarily agreed by the Khamenei and his office.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Dr. Pargu, there's a question on elections, particularly if there are differences in elections in the major metropolitan areas of Tehran, for example, and the rest of the country. and this is particularly in light of the experience of Ahmadinejad's election. Are there differences in the way people in big metropolitan areas vote for president as compared to smaller voting districts?
Yes, there is. First of all, thank you, everybody. Yes, there is a huge difference, and there are patterns, different patterns of voting between, between metropolitan areas and rural areas, and also between different elections. Like in presidential election, you have different patterns of voting in rural areas. Because you have this kind of homogeneous, political, say, trend across the country. But when it comes to parliamentary elections, Majlis elections, and you have different sets of, motives, different sets of coalitions. They are more local, so you have different people in different levels of, local, sometimes clans, families, and influential local, say, powers. They are competing each other. There is a huge difference. And Ahmadinejad, I think, 2009 election was one of the very interesting elections that shows how dynamic and how different cascades of voting patterns are working in the system, which you can't just simply combine and simplify in terms of conservative, conservatives and reformists or moderates or something. There are lots of different cascades of, voting patterns working on the same level. Like in Ahmadinejad's period, apparently the issue wasn't about conservatism and reformism. There was more other things, being played, like the kind of the distribution of wealth you had in many of these rural areas, which, during Ahmadinejad, Iran's Gini index has decreased to its minimum level in the history of, the register from probably 4 decades, 5 decades. So there were lots of different motives in rural areas. I think there is a huge difference. We have to be careful not to interpret all votings in Iran based on conservatism, reformism, being religious, being Western. There are many different kinds of, motives going on, different kinds of, like the way we see, we often try to interpret things based on what we see in Twitter trends. That's not what's going on in the, in reality. Like what we see in, Taliban today, it's very relevant. All of us, we're saying, oh, Taliban came in Twitter, but on the ground, I'm talking to people, they don't share the same concern I have. It's very strange, like my Shia friends. So almost the same thing sometimes happens in terms of Iran. And they're different levels, different cascades of, voting patterns.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Hamida, there's a question that has come from social media, has to do with the nature of the Iranian judiciary or the orientation of the Iranian judiciary under Raisi presidency, given that Raisi used to be the head of the judiciary and he is assumed to be, or he is known to be more conservative. Will the Iranian judiciary be more religiously strict under Raisi's presidency?
Well, I think more or less it's going to be the same, because we have the new judiciary head, Ghulam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, and sort of he has the similar background as Raisi does. He's a very hardline cleric, and also he was sanctioned by the West, and also he has very close ties with Khamenei, and also he has been part of the judiciary for a very, very long time. So I don't think there's going to be necessarily any changes, and I'm not optimistic on that. And by religiously strict, if you mean that the role of religion within the judiciary, it has always been the case since the establishment of the 1979 Constitution, which emphasized that religion plays a very important role. So I don't think there's going to be much changes with that regard, not even in human rights records of Iran. So yeah.
Thank you. Abdul Rasul, there's a question that has come regarding the level of consistency in Iranian foreign policy from one president to another, or one presidential administration to another. And the question is, whereas the rhetoric and the personalities change, does the substance of Iranian foreign policy also change from one administration to another, or is there remarkable consistency across the different administrations?
I think there is both happening at the same time. It means that there are a level of consistencies when we're talking about grants at the level of grand strategies and the level of big decisions, which needs a kind of a systemic-wide decisions and are difficult to assume that the president alone can change that. One of these issues, for example, is the US-Iran relation that we are seeing recently a lot of debate about that. So these types of grand strategies or grand directions, they are difficult to argue that the presidents can immediately change them or can impact on that. But as I said before, because of the role of the president, both in the Supreme National Security Council, his debates with the leader and his coalitions that can make with the different power centers in intelligence organizations, in military and others, in any sense, president finds an importance in pushing different debates and in setting different agendas. So that means that while we might have some level of consistency in grand strategies, the way that at the end decisions to solve crisis are taking place are very much impacted by who is in the office and the president, how he does the office and his competency, for example, and also, of course, the personal views. And I tried to also say in my presentation that part of this institutional evolution in Iran's foreign policy establishment was influenced by the people's personal potential to move between institutions and change the whole setting of institution with their movement outside or inside the institutions. So that basically tells us that, for example, just one example, and I finish my word, is that while we see, for example, the Expediency Council's case of resolving FATF as a failure, while the chance was given to it under Amoli Larijani, the same, we can see that the Quds force under Qasem Soleimani functions while in 2001 and 2003 is faced with a critical juncture. So the point is very much sometimes goes to the personal capacities of the people and who is at which time running what institution, and that gives a way to resolve a particular crisis. But my last point is that it's important that we remember that the decision-making in Iran's foreign policy is very much subject-centric. So when we want to talk about foreign policy issues and see who is involved and how decisions are taken, we need to go to our subject. Which subject we're talking will tell us a lot about who are probably active, who is more powerful in that process, and how the process forms and evolves.
Thank you. There's a question about elections. And we saw this trend that Shahram, this graph that Shahram showed, which demonstrated in a very dramatic sense the drop in election participation. So the question is, has Iran ceased to be a hybrid autocracy and is now just a dictatorship, and elections have become meaningless, or do elections still matter in one form or another?
Just very briefly, if I may, I think elections do matter, just because if the regime stops holding elections, it will give up all pretense of having popular mandate. So even though there is widespread apathy and widespread disillusionment with what may be changed and what reforms and what changes can be made within the system, which means low participation rate, the regime is not going to give up on elections. Short answer.
Thank you. Thank you. Mahmoud, anything to add to that?
I think, yeah, that's right. You know, elections they have risk and rewards, and what now is happening is that the regime is losing its risk appetite. It means that for different reasons, which one is that, you know, we don't have a good, you know, economic situation. The security is very volatile. So the whole thing is that there is a very, very, say, steep perception of threat from the regime that it feels that now is not good time to take these risks. But don't forget, all these risks are not just extra bonus for the regime. They are opportunity risks. They are survival risks. If you don't take these risks, you're done. So elections are not just luxury for the regime, just bring some added, you know, value for the regime. You don't take these risks, tomorrow you will have problem with radicalization of your opposition. You will have problem with don't understanding what's going on the ground. You don't have enough, you know, mechanisms of change by the change in the society, and all of those problems. In the long term, or probably even a small midterm, there would be huge, I think, repercussions and consequences of not having some kind of participatory elections. So what's going on? The trend is very bad. It means we are losing risk appetite. It means we are going towards some kind of minimalist, you know, just sham elections. But in the long term, if it is sustainable, you have to wait and see.
Perfect. Thank you. I should tell our audiences that Mahmoud and Shahram recently came out with this brilliant, really excellent book by Cambridge University Press on presidential elections in Iran, Islamic Idealism Since the Revolution. And I had an opportunity to read the book just before it was published, and I strongly recommend it. So these are two seasoned experts on presidential elections, and
thank you so much.
Recommend it. No, thank you guys for writing it. Hamid, the next question comes to you, and it's from one of our colleagues here, Majid Abu Omar, and Majid asks, to what extent can the judiciary be reformed from within? And can these reforms be a catalyst for bigger change within the system?
I think that's a very good question, because especially during what we saw, especially during Raisi's tenure within the judiciary, he tried to sort of implement reform within the judiciary. And actually, I have to say that oftentimes we say that there are, you know, public criticisms against the judiciary, but in fact, some of the judiciary heads themselves, they have acknowledged the shortfalls of the judiciary and have, you know, commented on its performance. And over time, there's always this emphasis that there needs to be corruption within needs to be dealt with, and that actually intensified with Raisi, especially. So I think, I mean, there is sort of a leeway for reform within, but I guess it's still limited, and I think we have to sort of see how the judiciary will evolve over time, because still I think, you know, the position of head of the judiciary, as I said, it was, you know, established with the amendments of 1989, so it's still a short, I think, period of time to sort of make those you know, big claims about, you know, significant changes within the judiciary, especially that. Yeah. Okay. No, it's okay. Go ahead.
So the last question also comes to you. And then, unfortunately, we're out of time. The last question, Hamida, has to do with the role of women and the relationship between women and the judiciary, particularly in light of Raisi's election. Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad that someone asked me about that question, because I think there is sort of a misconception about women's role within the judiciary, that they have sort of played a very limited role. And I think that their role actually has changed over time, especially when we look at, like, there was a very stark contrast between how the role of women changed, especially after the 1979 revolution versus now. I think there have been sort of like positive sort of changes with women roles, because I remember that in 1979, the temporary cabinet actually, they allowed for women to have administrative roles and also advisory roles. And what's interesting about this was that they advised National Oil Company to employ one of the women, some of the women whose judicial rank was reduced to an administrative rank. But currently, I think women play so many roles within the judiciary, like they can be prosecutors or and they can have sort of other roles like deputy prosecutor and so on, especially within family courts. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the role has changed over time, but I guess there still needs to be sort of, more, I guess, changes regarding women's role. But I don't think that they don't have, I wouldn't say that they don't have a role at all within the judiciary.
Are there women judges in Iran?
Yes. Yeah, there are, and they also have adjudication on certain cases as well. Thank you.
Okay. Perfect, thank you. Well, on that note, I want to thank all four of our presenters. You guys have managed to unpick and simplify for us the multiple complexities of a very convoluted and difficult political system. And for that, we are very grateful. Thank you so very much, Shahram Akbarzadeh, Abdul Rasul Div Salar, Mahmoud Pargu, and Hamide Dorzadeh. My sincere thanks also to our audiences around the world, and also to the colleagues here at the Arab Center who have worked behind the scene over the last 3 days to make this conference possible. Our colleagues in the audiovisual department, the translators, everybody, my sincere thanks. And from Doha, have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.